What if I told you that some of the most emotionally powerful rock ballads of the 1990s have been completely overshadowed by their own band's bigger hits? While everyone remembers Iris and Jeremy, there are incredible songs that reached #1 on charts, sold millions of copies, and defined an entire generation's heartbreak. Yet today, they're gathering dust in the forgotten corners of music history. These aren't deep cuts or B-sides. These are songs that Billboard called essential, that won Grammy nominations, and that shaped the sound of alternative rock forever. But here's the shocking part. Most people under 30 have never even heard of them. Today, we're diving into 10 forgotten 90s rock ballads that deserve way more respect than they get. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why music critics are calling this the most underrated collection of songs from the greatest decade in rock history. Song 1, Black Balloon, Goo Goo Dolls. When people think of the Goo Goo Dolls, their minds immediately go to Iris. And for good reason. That song spent 18 weeks at #1 and became one of the most recognizable ballads of all time. But here's what most people don't know. The band released another ballad that many critics consider even more powerful, and it tells one of the most heartbreaking stories ever put to music. Black Balloon was released in 1998 and peaked at #16 on the Billboard Hot 100. Unlike Iris, which was written for a movie, Black Balloon came from a deeply personal place. The song tells the story of a desperate man watching someone he loves struggle with heroin addiction. According to interviews with the band, this wasn't fictional. It was based on real experiences they'd witnessed in their circle. What makes this song criminally underrated is its restraint. Where many rock ballads of the era went big with orchestration and dramatic builds, Black Balloon stays modest and intimate. The guitar work is subtle, Johnny Rzeznik's vocals are vulnerable rather than soaring, and the overall production feels like you're listening to someone's private confession rather than a stadium anthem. Billboard's retrospective analysis noted that Black Balloon represented a more mature evolution of the Goo Goo Dolls sound, but it was unfortunately overshadowed by the massive cultural impact of Iris. The song's chart performance was solid, but it never received the same radio rotation or cultural penetration. Music critics who have revisited the song in recent years argue that it's actually the superior composition, more honest, more emotionally complex, and more representative of the band's growth as songwriters. Song 2, Stuck on You, Failure. Here's a name that even hardcore 90s rock fans might not immediately recognize, and that's exactly the problem. Failure was one of the most innovative guitar-centric bands of the decade, but they never achieved the mainstream success of their contemporaries, despite creating some of the most sophisticated alternative rock of the era. Stuck on You comes from their 1996 album Fantastic Planet, which was produced by Steve Albini, the same engineer behind Nirvana's In Utero and Pixies' Surfer Rosa. This isn't amateur hour. This is a band that was working with legendary producers and creating music that influenced countless bands that came after them. The song itself is a masterclass in controlled intensity. It opens with a discordant, hypnotic hook that immediately sets it apart from typical 90s alternative fare. The vocals are intentionally monotone and droning, but rather than sounding lazy or uninterested, they create this psychedelic, spacey atmosphere that draws you deeper into the song's strange world. What makes Stuck on You special is how it grooves without ever becoming predictable. Most rock ballads follow a verse-chorus-bridge structure that builds to an explosive climax. Stuck on You takes a completely different approach. It's mid-pace throughout, never rushing but never dragging either. It's like musical quicksand that slowly envelops you. According to Alternative Press magazine's retrospective on underrated 90s bands, Failure represented the road not taken for alternative rock. While bands like Bush and Live were creating radio-friendly versions of grunge, Failure was pushing the boundaries of what guitar rock could be. Stuck on You perfectly encapsulates this approach. It's heavy without being aggressive, melodic without being predictable, and emotional without being obvious. Song 3, Big Empty, Stone Temple Pilots. Stone Temple Pilots occupied a unique position in 90s rock. They were commercially successful enough to have multiple #1 albums, critically respected enough to earn Grammy nominations, but somehow always seemed to be fighting for legitimacy in a scene dominated by Seattle bands. Big Empty represents everything that made STP special, yet it's been overshadowed by their more aggressive hits. Released as the lead single from both their album Purple and the Crow soundtrack in 1994, Big Empty achieved something remarkable. Both albums reached #1 on the Billboard 200. This wasn't a minor hit. This was a song that helped propel 2 separate releases to the top of the charts simultaneously. The song showcases one of the most underrated rhythm sections in 90s rock. Eric Kretz's drumming is the secret weapon here. His ability to seamlessly transition between quiet verses and explosive choruses is what makes the song's dynamic shift so effective. According to music producer Brendan O'Brien, who worked with the band, Kretz was one of the most technically proficient drummers of the grunge era, but he never received the recognition of his contemporaries. Big Empty also demonstrates Scott Weiland's remarkable vocal range and restraint. This is a singer who could belt with the best of them, but he chooses to start the song with an almost whispered vulnerability before building to those soaring choruses. The lyrics deal with isolation and emptiness, themes that were central to 90s alternative rock, but Weiland approaches them with a poetry that sets him apart from many of his peers. The song's placement on the Crow soundtrack introduced it to millions of listeners who might not have otherwise discovered Stone Temple Pilots. But paradoxically, this might have hurt its legacy. Many people associate it more with the movie than with the band, and it's often overlooked when discussing STP's catalog. Song 4, Creep, Stone Temple Pilots. Before we continue, we need to address the elephant in the room. Yes, there's another famous song called Creep from the 90s, and yes, it's by Radiohead, but Stone Temple Pilots' Creep predates Radiohead's by several months and represents something entirely different, a glimpse into the future of alternative rock that most people never got to see. STP's Creep was released in 1992 as part of their debut album, Core. And according to music historians, it sounds like a direct precursor to the post-grunge movement that would dominate the early 2000s. Bands like Stained, Seether, and Creed all owe a debt to this song's approach of blending polished hard rock production with deeply introspective, emotional lyrics. The song peaked at #2 on the Billboard Mainstream Rock chart, making it one of the most successful rock ballads of 1992. Yet, it's been almost completely forgotten, while Radiohead's later song with the same title became one of the most iconic tracks of the decade. This is partly due to timing and partly due to the fact that Stone Temple Pilots were often dismissed as grunge bandwagon jumpers by critics who didn't take the time to understand what they were actually doing. What makes STP's Creep remarkable is its emotional honesty. Scott Weiland's lyrics deal with self-doubt, inadequacy, and the fear of not being good enough, themes that would become central to alternative rock throughout the decade. But where many bands would approach these subjects with anger or aggression, Weiland delivers them with a vulnerability that was unusual for rock music at the time. Song 5, Uninvited, Alanis Morissette. Here's a song that, by all objective measures, should be considered one of the biggest hits of the 1990s. Uninvited sold more than 7 million copies worldwide, reached #1 on the Billboard Top 40, earned Alanis Morissette 3 Grammy nominations, and she won 2 of them. It was also nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Original Song. These aren't the statistics of a forgotten song. These are the numbers of a massive cultural phenomenon. So why has Uninvited been overshadowed? The answer lies in the overwhelming success of Morissette's previous album, Jagged Little Pill. When you create one of the best-selling albums of all time, everything that comes after exists in its shadow, no matter how successful it might be on its own merits. Uninvited was written for the soundtrack of City of Angels in 1998, and it represents a significant evolution in Morissette's songwriting, where Jagged Little Pill was characterized by raw anger and emotional explosiveness. Uninvited shows a more mature, introspective artist dealing with complex themes of desire, boundaries, and spiritual connection. The song's production is notably different from anything else in Morissette's catalog. It's built around a hypnotic, Eastern-influenced guitar riff and features a more restrained vocal performance than fans had come to expect. This isn't the Alanis of You Oughta Know. This is an artist pushing herself into new territory. Music critics at the time recognized the song's quality. Rolling Stone called it haunting and beautiful, while Entertainment Weekly praised its sophisticated composition. The song spent weeks at the top of various charts and became one of the most played songs on adult contemporary radio for months. But here's the fascinating part. Despite its massive commercial success and critical acclaim, Uninvited has largely disappeared from cultural memory. It's rarely played on classic rock or 90s nostalgia radio. It's not featured in Best of the 90s compilations, and many people who lived through the era don't immediately recognize it when played. Song 6, Pretty Penny, Stone Temple Pilots. We're returning to Stone Temple Pilots because they represent one of the most misunderstood bands of the 1990s. While they're often dismissed as grunge followers, songs like Pretty Penny reveal a band that was actually ahead of its time, incorporating influences that wouldn't become mainstream until years later. Pretty Penny appears on STP's 1994 album, Purple, and it stands out immediately as something completely different from the rest of their catalog. This is an acoustic ballad with strong bossa nova influences. Not exactly what you'd expect from a band that was supposedly trying to copy Pearl Jam and Soundgarden. According to band interviews, Pretty Penny was directly inspired by 1960s folk rock and psychedelic pop, particularly the work of bands like The Byrds and Love. This wasn't a cynical attempt to chase trends. This was a band exploring their genuine musical interests and influences. The song's production is crucial to its impact, rather than the heavy, distorted sound that characterized most of STP's work. Pretty Penny features delicate acoustic guitars, subtle percussion, and what sounds like wind chimes adding texture throughout. The overall effect is dreamy and hypnotic, closer to what bands like Mazzy Star were doing than to traditional grunge. Music critics who have revisited Purple in recent years consistently point to Pretty Penny as evidence that Stone Temple Pilots were more musically sophisticated than they were given credit for at the time. The song pointed directly toward their next album, Tiny Music, which would see the band fully embracing psychedelic and experimental influences. The band performed Pretty Penny at the 1994 MTV Video Music Awards in a living room setup, with Scott Weiland rocking back and forth in a rocking chair as he sang. This performance style was revolutionary for a rock band at the time and showed an artistic confidence that belied their supposed status as trend followers. Song 7, Only Happy When It Rains. Garbage. Garbage represented something unique in the 90s alternative landscape, a band that was simultaneously part of the scene and completely separate from it. Only Happy When It Rains became their breakthrough hit in 1995, but what most people don't realize is that the song was actually a clever commentary on the very grunge scene it seemed to embrace. The song was the perfect introduction to Garbage because it encapsulated everything that made them special. Shirley Manson's vocals combined vulnerability with attitude, the production was both polished and gritty, and the overall sound was immediately recognizable while still being completely original. According to the band's own interviews, Only Happy When It Rains was written as a deliberate parody of grunge's tendency toward depression and self-pity. The lyrics celebrate melancholy and pessimism to such an extreme degree that they become almost comical. But here's the brilliant part. The song works perfectly well as a straightforward grunge anthem if you don't catch the irony. The track was produced by the band members themselves. Butch Vig, Duke Erickson, and Steve Marker were all experienced producers who had worked with major bands throughout the early 90s. Vig had produced Nirvana's Nevermind and Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream, so he understood the grunge sound better than almost anyone. This gave Garbage the ability to both celebrate and subvert the genre simultaneously. The song's music video became iconic for its saturated colors and Manson's striking visual presence, but it also reinforced the band's position as both insiders and outsiders in the alternative rock scene. They looked like a grunge band. They sounded like a grunge band, but they were actually something much more complex and self-aware. Only Happy When It Rains reached number 16 on the UK singles chart and became a staple of alternative rock radio throughout the mid-90s. It helped establish Garbage as one of the most important bands of the decade and showcase their ability to create songs that worked on multiple levels. Song 8, Love Is On the Way, Saigon Kick. One of the biggest misconceptions about 90s rock is that hair metal completely disappeared when grunge took over. The reality is more complex. Some hair metal bands successfully adapted to the changing musical landscape, creating some of the most emotionally powerful ballads of the entire decade. Saigon Kick's Love Is On the Way was released in 1992 as part of their album The Lizard, and it immediately proved that there was still room for technically proficient, emotionally direct rock ballads in the post-Nirvana world. The song reached number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100 and spent weeks in the top 20. This wasn't a minor hit. This was a genuine mainstream success. What made Love Is On the Way special was its production approach. Rather than the big, bombastic style that characterized most 80s power ballads, this song featured a more intimate, acoustic-based arrangement. The focus was on melody, harmony, and emotional delivery, rather than guitar pyrotechnics and stadium-sized choruses. According to music critics who reviewed the album, Saigon Kick earned praise for the variety of styles they incorporated into The Lizard. They weren't just a one-dimensional hair metal band trying to survive in a changing musical landscape. They were sophisticated musicians who could adapt their approach while maintaining their core identity. The song's success proved that there was still an audience for well-crafted rock ballads, even in an era dominated by grunge's anti-commercial ethos. Love Is on the Way spent significant time on MTV and rock radio, introducing the band to a much wider audience than they had previously reached. But here's what makes the song's current obscurity so puzzling. It was actually more commercially successful than many of the classic grunge ballads that are still played regularly today. It outsold and outcharted numerous songs that are now considered essential 90s tracks, yet it's rarely included in retrospective discussions of the decade's best music. Song 9, Change, Blind Melon. Blind Melon represents one of the great tragedies of 90s rock. They created some of the most innovative and emotionally complex music of the decade, but the death of lead singer Shannon Hoon in 1995 cut short one of the most promising careers in alternative rock. While everyone knows No Rain, and rightly so, as it's a perfect piece of neo-psychedelic pop, the band's deeper catalog contains songs that showcase a level of musical sophistication that was rare in the 90s alternative scene. Change is one of these hidden gems, a ballad that demonstrates the band's ability to create music that was both deeply personal and universally relatable. Blind Melon sold over 3.2 million albums in the United States, proving that there was a substantial audience for their neo-psychedelic approach to alternative rock. But unlike many of their contemporaries, they never seemed interested in chasing commercial success or fitting into established categories. Change exemplifies the band's approach to songwriting. The lyrics deal with personal transformation and growth, but they're delivered with a vulnerability and honesty that makes them feel like private confessions rather than public statements. Hoon's vocal performance is particularly remarkable. He manages to convey both strength and fragility, often within the same line. The song's musical arrangement showcases the entire band's abilities. The guitar work moves seamlessly between delicate fingerpicking and more aggressive playing, while the rhythm section provides a foundation that's both steady and dynamic. This is sophisticated musicianship disguised as simple, alternative rock. What makes Blind Melon's obscurity particularly tragic is how influential they were to bands that came after them. Their approach to combining classic rock influences with 90s alternative sensibilities can be heard in countless bands from the late 90s and early 2000s, but the original songs that established this template are largely unknown to younger listeners.